Hello and welcome to Chapter 9 of our textbook, Larson. In this chapter, we're looking at reducing project duration. Now, although this chapter is relatively short, there are some technical aspects to it, and I've gone wider afield and inserted a short clip from YouTube where someone is actually explaining the crashing by way of a whiteboard, which makes it a lot more easy to understand. So there are two videos in this section. So the first thing we look at is why might you want to reduce the length of time for a project? Well, quite clearly, if your boss has promised to a major client, this project will be completed in 6 weeks, and your project plan says 8 weeks, clearly something's going to have to give. So what we look at is reducing time, and there's always this trade-off between time and cost. You can do anything providing you're prepared to pay for it. Now, reducing the time of a critical activity almost always incurs additional costs. And the cost-time solution focuses on reducing or crashing activities, and that's a term you often hear in project management, crashing. And it's on the critical path, of course, which is the longest path through a project, in order to reduce the overall duration of the project. So the reasons for this, of course, there's as many of them as there are days in the week and days in the year. You might have a shortened time to get to market with, for example, a new product, which you might be wanting to launch, or there are unforeseen delays, or there's some type of incentive. You know, if you finish the project 10% ahead of time, you get paid a bonus of, X amount of money, and you then might sit and think, well, if it's going to cost X amount to shorten the project by 10%, that's still less than the bonus we get. So, it's probably worth trying to shorten the project. Impose deadlines. So if someone says, look, the deadline is now moved because of other factors, then you've got to do it. Whether there are issues with overheads that are starting to get out of hand, things that you can't control, or public goodwill, and the pressure to move resources to other projects, for example. Because that could be the type of organisation you have. You need to move resources from project A to project B because project B in terms of priorities is much more important. So where resources are not constrained, you can add resources, okay? You can outsource some of the project work. You can schedule overtime, but you see we're starting to push costs up. You can establish a core project team so you get some very focused and specific management, and you can do it twice as fast. Just do it faster. And yeah, there's a bit of interesting literature around which says project managers generally can always do stuff faster. And when resources are constrained, that is, when you just simply cannot increase the resources, then you might need to fast track things. You start to get rid of lag times and slack times. You might look at your critical chain and let's follow that through and see what we can shorten there. You might say, well, this project scope has to be reduced. We will do less. And you might want to compromise quality. Remember the iron triangle: cost, quality, and time. We prefer not to do that, of course. Now, you can represent this graphically. And what we see on this graph here is we have direct cost, and as the project continues, they become lower. Indirect costs, which might associate with materials, overheads, continue to creep up, and they might be a factor of project duration. And then you reach a point where you have your optimum cost time. And when you move to the right of that, as the project gets longer, it starts to cost you more money. So when you look at the top line, which is the total cost, like all of these things, you reach a point where you have a flexion point where this is the most suitable time to make a change. So what are some project costs here? And if you've been doing any work in accounting or finance, you'll know that there are indirect costs, which are costs that cannot be associated with any particular work package. So they might be the rent on the office that the project management team is in. And the project management team might be managing 6 other projects, and the rent for that is an overhead, or the electricity, or the cost of air conditioning, or the cost of insurance, the cost of supervision, administration, all those sorts of things there. They are generally invisible, but you can't run a business without them. And costs that vary over time. And those things, they tend to be, the more you do, they reduce project time. And if you reduce the project time, it directly reduces indirect costs. Sorry, I should have said indirect costs. If you reduce time, they tend to come down. So they are a factor of the project, and they're like a product of the project. So project costs can be the direct costs. And you know from your accounting, direct costs are those which are easily assignable to specific work packages, in this instance, project activities. So they could be the cost of tradespeople in a particular work breakdown package. They could be the cost of electricians in a work breakdown package, which is installation of electrical cabling, for example. Labour, materials, equipment, and of course, subcontractors. Subcontracting is where you contract out work that's to be done, either because it's a lower unit cost, it's easy to manage, you don't have that skill on staff, or whatever reason you have for outsourcing. And crashing activities, that is suddenly shortening the project. I mean, crash in this instance does not mean like a car crash, it means shortening. It increases direct costs. So what you need to do when you're looking at reducing project duration to reduce the project costs is you've got to have some data. You can't do it without information. So you gather information about direct and indirect costs on specific project durations. And the little YouTube clip we look at and the worked example in the text shows that. You search for critical activities with the lowest direct cost to shorten project duration. So you say, look, we look at the critical activity, which has the lowest cost of taking a day or two out. We pick that because we can save a bit of time and it's low cost than any other decisions. And then you look at the total cost for specific durations and you compare the benefits. So it's an analytical exercise. Got my tongue tied around that. And you then might need to construct a project cost duration graph. What's the relationship between costs and duration? You look at the total direct costs for selected project duration. So project duration of 10 days, direct cost $1,000. Project duration 12 days, direct cost $12,000. Find total indirect costs for selected project duration. So are the indirect costs going to move? And now the relationship between indirect costs and activities is not always linear. There might be other factors coming in. You know, the more you do something, the lower the unit price might be. You know, there's a million and one ways of looking at indirect costs. Then you add them together and you come up with a total cost and you compare the different alternatives. The main thing to remember is it involves detailed analysis of your costs, your activities, your durations, and your work breakdown packages, which sort of builds on everything we've covered so far in this course. So then you need to determine which activities you can shorten. So what you look for those activities that give you the lowest increase in cost per unit of shortening. And a unit of time might be a week, a month, you know, let's assume it's a day, and you have activity A. If you shorten it a day, it's going to cost you $60. Activity B, if you shorten the day, it's going to cost you $50. You think, well, I'll probably shorten activity B. Of course, it only costs me $50 because if I shorten activity A, it's going to cost me $60. I want the lowest case. So I've reduced the length of the project by a day, but I've increased the costs by $50. You begin to see the trade-off. Now, some of the assumptions we need to make are linearity, that the relationships between costs and duration are linear. Now, we know that that may not always be the case, which is why you need detailed data. And at normal time assumes low cost, efficient methods to complete the activity. And this is where it becomes challenging. Of course, your project management team might say, well, we can reduce the cost of A, B, and C. However, that will cause an increase in activities D, E, and F. So what we might save in terms of time on A, B, and C, we lose in additional costs in D, E, and F, and it may mean that we might need to take extra time to do that. because there might be a relationship between the activities that you shorten and the activities that remain. They may be precedent activities, and or there may be some type of relationships there, which is why in your project team you need honest communication and you need a good data set. And crash time represents a limit. That is the greatest time that you can reduce under realistic conditions. Now, of course, conditions might change. So if there's a weather disaster happening or a social disaster, a lot of the assumptions about time go out the window. And the slope of the line, as you know from your algebra, represents a constant cost per unit of time. As unit of time goes up, the cost goes up, and if the slope is 1, it's a completely linear relationship. But you might find as the duration goes up, the cost might increase out of proportion. And all accelerations must occur within the normal and crash times. That is, everything has to happen within the time boundaries that you've set, which of course you need to reality test all the assumptions that you make. And here's what it might look like on a graph. Here's an activity graph, and you see on the x-axis you have activity duration. In this instance, it's planned to be 10 units, but you need to crash it at 5. So you need to reduce what you're doing. So you can see here the normal cost at day 5 is $400, but the crash cost is $800. In other words, it's cost twice as much to reduce the duration. And that's a nice relationship there. It's a factor of 100%. So crashing basically is shortening a project. It costs extra time, and you need your critical pathway to do that. And you need to know the duration and the cost of each activity on your activity chart. When we come back, I've got a short video which we run, in which someone explains it very well. We'll look at the worked example, which is from the text. I won't give too much narration on it. That's a very good exercise to work through, and then we wind up.